History of Britain. Part 2. Chapter 4. Parliament against King. When Elizabeth I died without children, James Stuart, the Protestant son of Mary Queen of Scots, became king. He was already King James VI of Scotland. In 1603, he moved south to London as James I of England. James discovered that English and Scottish parliaments had very different ideas about their powers. In Scotland, Parliament passed any laws that the king wanted. In England, Parliament wanted to make decisions too. This made James's rule very difficult and brought even more trouble to his son. An important battle for control of the country was beginning. The Magna Carta. James wasn't the first king who disagreed with his people about his powers. Back in the 13th century, King John had similar problems. But in those days, there was no parliament. John wasn't a strong ruler. He started his rule with an empire in France, but he soon lost most of his French lands, even Normandy. His lords chose this time to put controls on the power of the king. In 1215, with armies behind them, the lords told King John to agree to the Magna Carta, a list of rules for good government. For example, the state couldn't put someone in prison without a good reason. Under the Magna Carta, even the king had to follow the law. John didn't want to sign the Magna Carta. In the end he did, but he broke its rules almost immediately. The lords attacked him with their armies. Before he was defeated, John died. Early parliaments. John's 9-year-old son became King Henry III and the lords went home. But then, as an adult, Henry decided to start an expensive war in Sicily, now in the south of Italy. The lords worried that he was becoming like his father, John. He was interested only in power and not in his people. They decided to ask Henry for a parliament of priests, lords, and ordinary landowners and businessmen. Without the agreement of this parliament, the king couldn't have tax money for his Sicilian war. This idea of a parliament was very new, tried before only on the Isle of Man, a small island between Britain and Ireland. The king refused to accept a parliament, so there was war closer to home. The lords defeated King Henry at the Battle of Lewes in the south of England in 1264. Henry and his son, Prince Edward, were taken prisoner. For the next 18 months England was ruled by a parliament. But Prince Edward escaped, formed an army and defeated the lords. King Henry was in control again. Parliament lost much of its power, but it didn't disappear. When Prince Edward became King Edward I, he needed money for his wars in Scotland. Higher taxes were more acceptable to the people when they were agreed by a people's parliament. Slowly, over the next few centuries, Parliament started to vote for and against new laws too, but it was nearly 400 years before Parliament had as much power as in 1264. Charles I, James I died in 1625. His son Charles became king. Charles I made the problems between king and parliament even worse. He started a very unsuccessful war against the Catholic countries Spain and France. Parliament tried to stop Charles's unfair taxes for the war, so Charles closed Parliament. He ruled without it for the next 11 years. Without a parliament, Charles couldn't have his people's tax money. He found other unfair and unpopular ways to get money. Then, when Charles made changes to the Church of Scotland, violent demonstrations started in Scottish cities. Charles didn't have enough money for an army to stop the demonstrations, so he had to have a parliament again. This new parliament didn't act as the king wanted, so Charles closed it after only 3 weeks. Charles fought the Scots with men who weren't professional soldiers. The Scots won and took control of a large part of the north of England. Charles had to have another parliament. This parliament stopped Charles's unfair taxes. But Charles needed soldiers again when there was violence between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. The politicians were worried. Maybe the king will use the soldiers against us, they thought. So they passed a law that Parliament, not the king, was now in control of the country, and that meant war. King and Parliament at war. In many families, brother fought brother and father fought son. The king's men won the first battle, but 4 years later, Charles I was defeated by Parliament and its army. Parliament couldn't agree what they should do next. But in the end, a court of law decided that Charles was an enemy of the people. In 1649, he was killed in front of a large crowd. His son, Charles II, was made king in Scotland, but Parliament soon defeated the Scots. Charles II had to escape to the Netherlands, leaving Parliament and the officers of its army in control of Britain. Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was an officer who fought for Parliament against the king. He introduced new ideas to his army and turned his men into excellent professional soldiers. At the end of the war, he was the most powerful man in Britain. Parliament offered him the title king. Cromwell refused it, preferring the title Lord Protector. But for 8 years he ruled the country like the kings before him. Cromwell was a Puritan, so he disliked music and dance. Soon all the theatres were closed. Even Christmas was against the law, the return of the king. When Cromwell died, his son became Lord Protector. But he wasn't a strong ruler, and he couldn't control the army. So a group of politicians invited Charles II to return home. Most people were very pleased to have Charles II as king. But Charles didn't like Parliament, and for most of his time as king he ruled without it. That meant no tax money, so he used money from the King of France, Britain's last Catholic king. Charles II and his wife had no children. When Charles died in 1685, his Catholic brother James became king. James II started giving all the important jobs in the army and the universities to Catholics. He tried to get Catholics into Parliament. This was a bad idea, because Catholics were hated by most of the population. In 1688, a group of politicians invited Prince William of Orange, the Protestant Dutch husband and cousin of James's daughter Mary, to bring his army to England. When James's own army joined Prince William, James escaped to France, a new law for kings and queens. Parliament was tired of kings who ruled without them. William and his wife Mary were asked to be king and queen, but first they had to agree to a new law. There could be no taxes, no army, and no new laws without the agreement of Parliament. Politicians were now chosen every 3 years, and no Catholic could ever become king or queen, William and Mary agreed to Parliament's new law. But the law didn't give Parliament all the power that some politicians were hoping for. William was a strong king who didn't leave the important decisions of government to Parliament. Parliament didn't have to wait long for more power. William and Mary had no children, so Mary's sister and became queen after them. But when all Anne's children died young, there was a serious problem. Who could rule Britain after Anne? There was only one possible person who wasn't Catholic, the German grandson of James's daughter. He didn't speak English, and he didn't like Britain. But when Anne died in 1714, he became King George I for Parliament. George I was the perfect king. He wasn't interested in Britain, so Parliament was left in control of the country. And Parliament was careful that it never lost its power again. After 1714, the important decisions were made by politicians. Today's Queen, Elizabeth II, is from the same family as George I. She's Britain's head of state, but she has no real power. Chapter 5. Power to the people. From the 15th century, ordinary people had the same protection under the law as lords, but nobody imagined that ordinary workers had any real power. Only people with money could vote for politicians or join Parliament. Poor people did what they were told, but then, in the late 18th century, Britain began to change. Historians now call the changes revolutions because they were so important. There were new types of job, new towns and new ways to travel. And there were also new powers and protections for the ordinary workers of Britain. Revolution in the country. Until the 19th century, most people in Britain worked on the land. They grew plants for food and kept farm animals. They produced butter and cheese. And in their homes they turned sheep's wool into cloth. English cloth was popular everywhere in Europe. Farmers couldn't use all their fields every year. After a few years, the plants became unhealthy, so they left the field empty for a year. But in the 18th century, people found new ways to grow food. Farmers never had to leave a field empty, so they could produce more food. The new ideas for farms could only work on large areas of land, and most farmers had small areas in different fields. In the second half of the 18th century, the government agreed to give a lot of land to the most powerful landowners. Many poorer farmers were left with nothing. Revolution in towns. Also in the 18th century, there were changes in the cloth-making business. New machines helped to make cloth much faster than before. The machines were too big to keep at home. The world's first factories were built. These factories employed many of the farmers who lost their land to the big landowners. Soon large towns grew around the factories. Manchester and Leeds, for example, grew in this way. The factories made cloth from local wool, and also from American cotton. British cloth became even more popular in Europe than before. When the French Emperor Napoleon, Britain's great enemy, invaded Russia, his soldiers were wearing coats of British cloth. British factories were soon copied in other European countries and their empires, and the world changed forever. But these wonderful new machines didn't help the ordinary people of Britain. Brunel. Many new roads, waterways, and bridges were made in the 18th century. Then, in 1804, the world's first railway was built. Britain's greatest railway builder was Isambard Kingdom Brunei. He built more than 1,600 kilometers of railway line. His trains were faster, and his stations and bridges were more beautiful than any others. He changed not only train travel, but also travel across the Atlantic Ocean. He built the first metal passenger ship, and another ship that was 6 times bigger than any other ship at that time. Many factory owners in the late 18th and early 19th century controlled their workers' lives in a similar way to the Norman lords 700 years earlier. Workers weren't paid with money, but with cards that were only accepted in the factory shop. Adults were paid too little to feed a family, so their children worked in the factory too, some for 18 hours a day, and there were a lot of accidents. The factory owners built houses for their workers, but most of these were cheap and small, with no clean water. Illness traveled quickly through the new towns. The factory owners grew richer and richer, but their workers got no more money when the factory was successful. If workers started a trade union, they lost their jobs. If they refused to work, they weren't paid. Then their families had no food. Better laws for workers. Workers became very angry. There were a lot of demonstrations, and some people wanted a violent British Revolution, the Revolution of 1789 in France. It was difficult for workers to change things in any other way. Ordinary workers didn't own their own houses, so they couldn't vote. Some cities, like Manchester and Birmingham, had no politicians because they were too new. But old towns with small populations had politicians. It was very unfair. Politicians didn't want a revolution, so they slowly gave workers more control over their lives. After a change in the law in 1825, workers could finally form trade unions. In 1832, the new cities got their own politicians and more men could vote. Children's hours of work were also controlled in the 1830s, and the government offered children a few hours a day of free school lessons. From 1870, all children had to go to school. Child workers disappeared from British factories. Votes for all. In the 19th century, more and more men were given the vote, but women still had no power. The suffragettes were a group of women who wanted to change this. In the early 20th century, they went on violent demonstrations. They shouted at politicians in Parliament. In prison, they refused to eat. One woman was killed when she threw herself under the king's horse during a race. But when the First World War started in 1914, these women stopped fighting the government. They did the jobs of the men who were away at war. When the war ended, some women over the age of 30 and all men over the age of 21 could vote. Finally, in 1928, the rules for women and men became the same, an end to poverty. Workers' lives at the end of the 19th century were a little better than 100 years before. But when, in 1899, new soldiers were needed for a war in South Africa, large numbers of young men were too unhealthy for the army. The government decided to do more for the poor of Britain. In 1906, pay was introduced for people who couldn't work as a result of illness or old age. It was a small amount, but it was something. After the Second World War ended in 1945, there was more money from the government for old people. There was also money for families with children and for people who couldn't find work. Schools, hospitals, doctors and dentists were, and still are, free. Britain was the first state to protect its people in this way. Taxpayers have to pay for it, of course. But people are protected from the terrible poverty and unhealthy lives of earlier centuries. Chapter 6. Britain's Great Empire. In the 1930s, about a quarter of the world's population was ruled by the British. The sun never goes down on our empire, they said. They meant that it was always daytime somewhere in the empire. They also meant that their empire was forever. Perhaps they didn't remember the history of their first empire, an empire that was lost more than 150 years earlier, British America. The religious enemies of Britain's rulers had the first successes of empire. In 1620, a group of English Puritans sailed to America in a boat called the Mayflower. They wanted to practice their religion freely and openly, and this was impossible in England. They built homes on the east coast of America, in an area that they called New England. Their first winter was very hard, and more than half of them died. The rest escaped death only because they had help from the local people in the next few years. Many people followed them across the Atlantic, Puritans and Catholics for religious reasons, and businessmen who were interested in trade. By the middle of the 18th century, there were 1.6 million British people living in North America. Then, in 1763, Britain defeated France in the 7 Years' War and won control of Canada too. Sometimes there were attacks by the local American Indians, so the British Americans needed protection. The British government in London wanted taxes from the Americans to pay for an army, but the Americans had no politicians in Parliament, so to them the taxes were unlawful. In 1776, they decided to become independent from Britain. 5 years of war followed. Finally, the British accepted that the US was an independent country. Only Canada continued to be British. The British in India. On the other side of the world, there was better news for the British Empire. In the 17th century, a private English company, the East India Company, controlled a few ports on the west coast of India. To protect their trade interests in times of war, the East India Company employed an army of English officers and Indian men. In 1756, the ruler of Bengal, in northeast India, attacked British soldiers in his capital, Calcutta. He put many of them in prison overnight, but the prison didn't have enough air. In the morning, most of the soldiers were dead. The British called this prison the Black Hole of Calcutta. They sent an army to defeat the Bengali ruler. From this time, the real ruler of Bengal was the East India Company. Slowly, other Indian states came under British control. By the middle of the 19th century, all India was part of the British Empire, British lands around the world. The British Empire was also growing in other parts of the world. Criminals were sent abroad because it was cheaper than prison. They went to America before it became independent. Then, from 1788, they were sent in large numbers to Australia. Soon other people were making their homes there too, and in New Zealand and Canada. If the local people, the Aborigines, Maoris and American Indians, were lucky, they only lost their land. If they were unlucky, they were killed. The area around Cape Town in the south of Africa became British in 1806 after a war with the Dutch. It was a useful place because it was halfway on a ship's journey between Britain and India. Egypt was another useful part of Africa, between Europe and Asia. Napoleon and his French army invaded Egypt in 1798, but the British, under Horatio Nelson, destroyed most of Napoleon's ships in a battle on the River Nile. Horatio Nelson. British success in 19th century trade and empire was only possible because Britain ruled the seas. This control was mainly the result of the sea battles of Horatio Nelson. Nelson lost an arm in battle, and he could only see out of one eye. But he knew how to defeat enemy warships. After his success in Egypt, he fought the French and Spanish at the Battle of Trafalgar 1805. Nelson was killed in the battle, but most of the enemy ships were destroyed, and Britain's sea power was made safe for the next 100 years. The central point of London today is Trafalgar Square, with Nelson in the middle, made of stone. The war against Napoleon. Napoleon had more success in his battles on land than at sea. Soon he controlled a large part of Europe. He planned an invasion of Britain, but then he changed his mind and invaded Russia. A big mistake. He lost 3/4 of the 450,000 soldiers who went with him. At the same time, the British army pushed his soldiers out of Spain and Portugal. Finally, in 1815, he was defeated by Britain and Prussia at the Battle of Waterloo. Empire in Africa. France and Britain continued to build their empires in Asia and in Africa. Other European countries, or Italy, Germany, Belgium, joined them in a race to rule Africa. The British fought for a long time against the African Zulus and the Dutch-speaking White Boers for control of South Africa and its gold. They moved north from there and south from Egypt until they controlled land from the top to the bottom of Africa. Queen Victoria. Victoria became queen in 1837, at the age of 18. She had little real power over the world's most powerful country, but politicians listened to her strong opinions. She loved the idea of empire, and she was pleased with the title Empress of India. She was the mother of 9 children and the grandmother of most of the kings and queens of Europe. When she died in 1901, very few people remembered a time before the Victorian Age, the First World War. By the early years of the 20th century, Germany, not France, was Britain's biggest enemy. German factories were becoming more successful than British ones, and the Germans were starting to build a lot of warships. The British didn't want to lose their control of the seas. They started a race to build more warships. At that time, the countries of Europe were grouping together for protection against their enemies, France and Russia against Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. The British decided to join with France and Russia. When the future Emperor of Austria was murdered by the Serbs in 1914, the Russians joined the Serbs in war against the Austrians. This was the start of the First World War. People from Britain and the Empire fought against the Germans in Belgium and the north of France, and against the Turks in Gallipoli, West Turkey. It was a new type of war. Nobody knew how to defeat enemy machine guns. The numbers of dead went higher and higher. On a single day in 1916, 20,000 British soldiers were killed. In the end, the Americans fought with the British, and the Germans and Austrians were defeated. But there were no real winners in this terrible war. The 1920s and 1930s. Lands from the German and Turkish empires became British, but there was trouble after the war in other parts of the empire. Much of Ireland became independent and India wanted independence too. Japan's power in Asia was growing. Were the British areas of Asia safe? Britain wasn't as rich as before the war. In the 1930s, many factories closed and workers lost their jobs. A lot of people were unable to feed their families. When Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, the British didn't want another war. There wasn't enough money for a strong British army. And Hitler only wanted land that Germany lost after the First World War, but Hitler wanted more and more land. When he took control of Austria and Czechoslovakia, of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, the British did nothing. But it became clear that he was a danger to all Europeans. There were stories that he was sending large numbers of German Jews to prison for no reason. When he invaded Poland in 1939, the Second World War began. The Second World War. At first the war went badly for Britain. British soldiers went to France, but they were soon pushed out again by the powerful German army. By 1940, France was under German control. Hitler was making plans to invade Britain. First, he had to win control of the skies above Britain. The Battle of Britain was the first real air battle in history. German and British planes fought for 3 months, but the Germans couldn't defeat the British airmen. Finally, like Napoleon before him, Hitler chose to invade Russia, not Britain. Unlike Napoleon's, his invasion failed. The US was now fighting on the same side as Britain, and together they pushed the Germans out of France. At the same time, the Russians were pushing the Germans back through the countries of Eastern Europe. By May 1945, Germany was defeated and Hitler was dead. But the war in Asia continued. Japan joined Germany in the war in 1941 and took control of many British lands in Asia. 250,000 British and American soldiers and ordinary people were made prisoners by the Japanese. But the Americans finally defeated the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean. The British pushed them out of Burma and India. In August 1945, Japan was defeated. Winston Churchill. Churchill was from an important family of lords and politicians, and he joined Parliament at the age of 25. In the 1930s, he realized before most people in Britain that Hitler was very dangerous. When the Second World War began, he soon became head of the government. Because of his powerful speeches in the most difficult months of the war, the British started to believe that they could win. Churchill played a very important part in the war against Hitler, the end of the empire. After the Second World War, Britain couldn't keep control of its empire. India and Pakistan became independent in 1947, and most other countries in the empire soon followed. Hong Kong stayed British for a much longer time, but in 1997 it became part of China. When the countries of the empire became independent, most of them joined the Commonwealth. This is a group of states that work together on many important matters, like business, health and the fight against poverty. The British Queen is still the head of the Commonwealth today. Britain's place in the world. Britain is part of the Commonwealth and the European Union, and, as a result of its history and language, it works closely with the US too. Britain's days of world power have ended, but it is still richer and more powerful than most countries in the world. Without its empire, Britain is a small country again, but a small country with a big history. The end. Hope you have enjoyed the reading. Come back to learn English with me, or American English and British English, to find more fascinating and exciting stories.